Are you a photographer struggling with all the buttons and knobs and dials and numbers and fractions and formulas and exposure triangle, and you're pulling your hair out, about ready to give up on learning anything about your nice camera? I have got a simplified formula for you today. Don't worry, by the end of this video, you will know the easiest way to set your camera, all the settings, when you're out on location at a photo session. Ready? Monique here in Silverpaw Studio, founder of ProPetPhotog, and I primarily photograph pets and people, so a lot of my examples today will be about that, but this formula works for any type of photography. Just trust me. Now, although I am standing in my studio, we won't be talking about like studio lighting and things. This is real basic. This is outside on location using whatever light you got. You can add on lights later. Okay, so you want to see my great formula? This is all you have to remember. This is all you have to remember. MyDoGS. Ah, yes. In your mind, when you're out in a session or out in the field, you go, what do I want to set? MyDoGS. Not my dog Bailey. MyDoGS. So this is all the camera settings that you have, the basic ones, to get the photo that you envision. Now, it is important to consider what you want out of this photo. Have a little vision of what you're going to photograph before you start messing with these. But if you're still not quite sure, let's go into the first part of the formula. This is obviously not true math, but you know. So MyDoGS, oops, this should be a V, huh? That was just for the acronym, so you won't forget it. So MVD. In here, this is what we want to decide on first. And that is motion or depth. What's more important to us? Motion, which is stopping or following motion, or the depth of our image. Do you want just a little bit in focus, or do you want everything in the frame to be in focus? So those are the two things you need to consider very first. Let's write this down. M is for motion. You know that you're going to be out at a field with a dog. It's pretty nice light out, so the dog's going to be running around, and you really want to get those action photos, okay? So the dog is running back and forth or even toward or away from you. So your main goal is to stop and follow the motion. So motion is what you're all about here. The depth of the image is what it is, okay? So let's say motion is more important to us. Okay, that'll help us set our very first setting. And that is, have you guessed it? Motion equals shutter speed. All right. Editing Monique here with a quick hack for knowing what shutter speed to use. Simply take the focal length of whatever lens you're using and set at, and make that your shutter speed. If I'm using my 70 to 200 zoomed all the way into 200, I need to have my shutter speed minimum of 1/200 just to hand hold my camera for fairly sharp images. Now, technology has come a long ways, of course, so we have a lot of stabilization built into our lenses and our cameras, but this is a good starting point. If you want to photograph motion, you're going to need to be at least 1/1000th of a second to stop the motion. If you're following the motion, it just depends on how fast they're going, but I would really start at 1/1000th of a second. If it's a fast dog or maybe a fast bird or car that you're photographing, you might have to crank up your shutter speed even more, okay? So that's the first thing you want to decide when you want to stop or follow the action and the motion. So you'll set your shutter speed at an ideal. Okay, we're talking ideal here. And then you can set your next setting. And if you don't care about the motion, maybe you do care about the depth. Maybe you've got a nice older dog that the owner just really wants some nice portraits, or you have an adult you're photographing, you're just going to be doing some nice posed still images. And in that case, you envision a photo of this dog with like his eyes in focus and everything behind him kind of blurred out, really having your eye, the viewer's eye, drawn to his eyes, right? So in that case, you're really more concerned about the depth. Motion is not a factor. So you could even have your lens all the way down to 1/140, but what's the other setting? Have you guessed it yet? The depth equals your aperture. So let's say you set your ideal aperture. You think, okay, this is a mid-sized dog and I want their eyes and a little bit of their nose in focus. Remember, some dogs' noses are pretty long. And you think, you know what, I think ideal is gonna be 4.0 as the aperture. The smaller the number, the bigger the opening. So, okay, so you set that, and then whatever complements that is your shutter speed. So let's say you have a nice bright sunny day again, your aperture is 4.0, well, your shutter speed's probably gonna be pretty high, so you can balance that out, okay? So I'm gonna give you the third setting here in a second. This will make more sense. So depth is how much of the foreground all the way to the background do you want in focus, and your aperture will help you with that. And so do you want just the eyes? Do you want the whole dog? Do you want a little bit of the foreground? Do you want middle ground? Do you want everything behind him? What do you want in focus? Maybe you don't want just the eyes. Maybe there's a cool, beautiful mountain scene behind them or a pretty tree, and you want that tree in focus or out of focus. So those are things you need to think about. Foreground, before your subject, middle ground, background, all of these parts of your image. Editing Monique here to add that also with aperture, if you have multiple subjects, multiple dogs, multiple people, this will definitely affect your aperture too, as the sum may be a little forward, a little back, bigger or smaller. And so you want to also keep in mind with your aperture or your depth settings, all your different subjects in the frame. One thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about the depth is your actual lens. So this is a wider lens at the 24 mil. The wider your lens, the more things are just going to be in focus. And think about your GoPros, everything's in focus. But if I were to put my beloved 70 to 200 millimeter lens on here and have it zoomed all the way into 200, I'm naturally going to get more blur in the background. That compression is going to do that. When I'm photographing wildlife and I have a 200 to 600 mil lens on, and I'm at f5.6 or even 6, it is still going to be blurry behind them. If I had 6.0 on 24 mil, it's still going to be pretty sharp. So you need to keep that in mind too, which lens you're using. You've got these two things that you really want to concentrate on. And then you add in G, dogs, right? And G is the grain or the noise. How much of that are you willing to accept? And that is your ISO. So grain, noise, grain was from film days, but it went with dogs, okay. So how much grain are you willing to accept in this image? So it might be that sunny day, and you can have the lower the ISO, the smaller the grain. Think of like sand is that 100 ISO, 200. Once you keep going up, a boulder or a pebble or a rock, that's going to be bigger pieces of grain, more distorted. So if you're at 800 ISO, it's going to have a bigger grain than the littler ones, okay? Now consider your camera when you're setting this. Some cameras do really well with the high ISO, and some don't. So you need to know your camera and what its real limits are. My camera, I think it goes up to something really ridiculous. There is no usable image from that high of an ISO, even though it technically can get that high. So know your camera, how high the ISO goes, and then how much you're willing to have grain in your images. So you're gonna have to change things up from your ideal, keeping your main image, final image in mind. So obviously all this equals your settings. I probably should have mentioned that. And so we've got depth, grain, or noise equals the settings. So you can kind of see how all of these figures go together without truly getting in depth in the exposure triangle. These would be the 3 sides. You can pick one that's most important to you and then fudge around the other 2 as much as you want. Some people call this chimping. That's up to you. But really start with what your ideal would be. Let's say every time you go out, you're just going to have your ISO set to 400 and just set it aside. You want to stop the motion. So, okay, I want 1/1200th of a second. All right, well, that gives me this aperture. And you go, okay, I can live with that much grain. I don't need that depth of field, but this freezes the action. Perfect. So have a baseline in mind for each scenario, whether you want motion or depth. Say you want the depth. You want to get all this in focus, yeah? So you set it and forget it, your ISO 400, let's say, and set it aside. But you really need that big depth of field, right? So maybe you're going to F11. So you're going to get, the higher the number, the more depth of field. So F11 or F8, F22 is the longest. You're going to get everything in focus there, right? And then you can set your shutter speed from there. How much depth do we want? How much grain are we willing to put up with? And then the third number falls into place. Just watch the histogram and the levels in your camera and just take test shots. It's fine to do that. If you say, okay, this is ideal, take a picture, look at the histogram and go, oh, this will work or this won't work. And you will get a feeling for this every single time. Every time I go out on a session, if I'm doing a close-up headshot, I typically am caring more about aperture. I want everything to blur out behind them. Then when we switch to an environmental scene, we want to see the field and the trees. Then I want a higher aperture, and maybe that dog's running through the field. So I need both of these. All right, what am I willing to give up in the grain setting? Okay, the ISO. I hope this makes sense to you. It really makes sense to me. It's lots easier to think of your motion or versus depth, add in your grain and you have your settings, than the exposure triangle and all of the formulas and equations and all of that out there, okay? So next time you're on location and you don't know where to start with your settings, think of MyDoGS. That's all you need to do is think of MyDoGS. M versus D, add in the G, then you have your S, right? Motion, depth, grain equals shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and then you have your settings. That's it. That's all you need to know. Woo! You're welcome. Go out there and try it. Tell me how it goes in the comments. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I'll see you in the next video. Be sure to like and subscribe if this was interesting to you and you want to see behind the scenes and all kinds of things about pet photography, the business side and the craft side. This is a place for you. Yeah. All right. I'll see you in the next video. And as always, I wish you many woofs, purrs, and TREATSs.